When I realised that the into, as it were, the lever into these presentations was the place of the latihan in what I had been doing, I was stuck, because I've been following the latihan, I realised last year, for 50 years. And I find it so difficult to say, well, this was definitely the latihan. Oh, and I received this and I did that. So just knowing that the latihan has just been a central part of my life. I think we have 20 minutes. So I sorted myself out little sets of 5 minutes, which I hope will work. Because at the moment, now I'm well retired, what I do with my life out there is involved with running a dream work group and telling stories. And so this is a little set of stories. I first got into, well, as soon as I learned to read, I was enamored with stories. The very first book I remember being able to read for myself at the age of 4 was a book which is now forbidden, Little Black Sambo. And I loved this book, this wonderful hero of a little lad who'd taken on some tigers and beaten them at their, and then being rewarded with pancakes. What child doesn't like pancakes? And so I became a recluse with books, being an only child and being in a household where books were sacrosanct. It was very easy to curl up in an armchair with a book, and a parent would come in and say, oh, you need to do such and such. I'll just finish this chapter. And then I'd be forgotten about again. I'm sure many of you will have experienced the same thing. And then when I was 8, I found an old book on the bookshelf, which had been my mother's mythology book when she was at school. And I fell in love with Perseus, the hero Perseus. And at that time, it was just an adventure story, and his confrontation with Medusa, who turned people to stone, and the helps that the goddess gave to him. And it was a wonderful story. And I read myth after myth after myth. And gradually I began to feel to myself a little like, I don't know if any of you as children would look at an atlas of the world and see the way that continents would fit into one another like an enormous jigsaw puzzle, so that if some of the big land masses were moved, they could very easily become one. And maybe they had been one to begin with and then separated. And I think quite a few children did that. And then the scientists, the geologists working on tectonic plates caught up with us. But I found that in reading all the different stories, I was discovering that for myself, that there were patterns in these stories. And what might be an Indian myth could be mirrored in a Russian story or a North American Indian story. And this fascinated me. And then when I was about 20 and at college in Birmingham, I mentioned this earlier this morning, in Handsworth, where I was living at the time, there was the most magnificent library. And in there, I found a big old book, which was a collection of Grimm's fairy tales, still written in the language they had used, which was High German. Didn't mean a thing to me. But every page was half full of notes which had been translated into English. And there I learned that the Grimm brothers themselves had made the same similar links to me. And in these notes, it showed the way they had traced the fairy story, the household tale, back to one of the Germanic myths, or, you know, another one. And they had made this link of paths. And then as I continued in my investigations, they were not the only ones. And then later I discovered Carl Jung and someone called Joseph Campbell, who had worked on Jung's theory of the life path of the hero. For Jung, it was the sun hero because he was Northwest European. If we go to other cultures, the sun is often a goddess. And so I think I'm coming to the end of that 5 minutes. And then I found myself, after doing a postgrad in London, I found myself working in a school in Southeast London, 2,000 girls in a comprehensive school with a 13-stream entry level. So as a student, if you were in stream 13, you knew you hadn't really got much for you in your life ahead. And I found myself on my timetable a very troublesome class at 13th stream. The beauty of it was that I was an art teacher at that stage. And art teaching, you can get away with a lot. It comes under the heading of creativity. And so the first lesson in, I went girding my loins, as they say, and struggled, and we finally got to a point where they might possibly be considering doing some work. And one of them noticed a book sticking out of my basket. "Here, miss," she says, "what you got there? What's that book?" And I said, "Oh, it's a collection of fairy tales, actually, Grimm's fairy tales." "Oh," says another one, "will you read them?" So I said, "Well, you settle down and you do some work and I'll read to you." And you could have heard a pin drop. These 13-year-olds who, you know, had come from having a fag round the back and they got their makeup on, hitching their skirts up and waiting to visit their boyfriends outside the gate. They were just enthralled by these stories. And we moved on to mythology, and they too fell in love with Perseus. And they decided themselves that they wanted to use the art lesson to get together a performance of the Perseus myth for the end of year presentation to the whole school. I must say, many of the other teachers had huge doubts about this when I took the idea. They wouldn't be capable of it. But others, and we had a very forward-looking headmistress, she supported me. And so they worked hard, they made their masks, they made their props. And one of the heartwarming things was that the two little mice in the class, these were two little girls, and it didn't matter how big a piece of paper you gave them or how big a brush, they would do little tiny things in the middle and really didn't fit in with the others. They got together and they made themselves a two-headed costume. They were going to be the sea monster, where Perseus turns the sea monster into stone to rescue the princess. And so they both got inside this costume with a head each. And when it came to the performance, they roared up and down the stage and terrified everybody. And they were an enormous success. And that really underlined for me the power of story. And from then I just went on. Then I come to some stories from Subud life. At the time that I was working at Kidbrooke at this school, I was around Subud people. I don't know if Maya is still here, but she was one of the very first people that I met who was actually doing the latihan. And so then I moved on into Subud. I'm just looking at my notes, what I should be doing here. Yes, we went, I eventually started taking part in Subud life, and it ended up being a KG1 councillor for a time, and went to Colombia, the World Congress there. And that was where we were introduced to the body awareness testing. And this was a wonderful discovery. And there were quite a few stories around that happened for people in Colombia itself. But when I got home, by that time, I was retraining in psychotherapy. And which was, I first of all discovered dream work when I was about 35. And then in my 40s, I just went back to study again and retrained. And I found myself one day sitting with a particularly difficult client, and I realized that I was listening to my jaw, and I waited for my jaw and my tongue to tell me when it was right to say something to the client. And a thought would come into my mind and my tongue would go stiff. No, not that one. And this was my introduction to my own body awareness. And I you know, it's magic. I love magic. I love the magic in my life. And so often it is linked with the latihan. And so often it's unconscious. I realize, wow, this must be the latihan. And so, yes, listening to my mouth, body five, and yeah. And then I carried on working with Subud and moved over eventually to working with Sushila Dharma International. And I was on the international board helping to organize Sushila Dharma's presentations at the Puebla Congress. And working with an American guy called Michael Menduno, I came up with the idea of story cards. And we contacted the different projects which Sushila Dharma was involved with, supporting. And we asked each of them to submit just a small story, no bigger than a paragraph, which we then had printed onto postcards. And we had about 8 postcards, projects, stories. And we had them printed once we got to Puebla. And we took to leaving one day we would select this particular project. And we would just leave story cards lying around. And people began collecting them and wanting to know when the next one was. And it was a very effective way of drawing people's attention to the work that Sushila Dharma was doing then. And we also had quite a hand in encouraging people for the actual big concert at the end of a couple of project leaders telling their story on the stage. And story commercially now, Arifin, designers come forward, you know, they've been asked to work on an ad and say, well, what's the story? What's the story of your product? And that's how people are looking to sell things now. And my last story is, again, as working with Sushila Dharma International. And I do recommend that people get involved with these organizations within Subud. Wonderful opportunities are opened to us. And several times I went to Geneva, to the United Nations, to their weeks, Women and Children Weeks. And one year I went to represent a paper which had been submitted by a Subud member, Rashid Cesar, who was working in Argentina, in prisons with women and children, developing his program of interaction, drama-based things, and working again with the guards within the prisons, the women officers, training them so that they could work with the women and children. And he couldn't go himself to present his paper, so I did it. You get 2 minutes, 2 very strict minutes each person who needs to present the paper. So that's what I did, as well as meeting the most amazing women who were doing so much dangerous work in places like Southern Africa, in war-torn zones, working with women and children. Very, very humbling stories. But came the last day, and lots of people were already going home, and I stayed for the afternoon closing session. I was sitting at an empty bench, just me, middle of the bench, listening away with my earphones on, and the doors flap open behind me, and this vision of feminine loveliness comes in. She'd obviously been shopping, bags from the best shops. She looked gorgeous. She looked at me, and she came and she sat next to me. And it was as though the bench itself was full of people. She squeezed in and she shuffled up to me and then started talking to me. What was I doing here? Why had I come? So I told her about Rashid. I'd come to present a paper from someone called Rashid Cesar. Rashid Cesar, you know him. I have been trying to get in touch with him for 6 months. She was the justice, worked in the justice minister's office, and they wanted him as a consultant, and they hadn't been able to, so I was able to provide that link. And I think possibly the latihan itself might have had a little place in that particular story of my life. And yeah, I carry on loving stories, reading more, discovering more, and working with people with their dreams. And I'm very, very privileged. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Hester. That was amazing. Wonderful collection of stories. I'm sure people have questions. I can't see everybody again, so if anybody has questions. And Andrew?
Thank you. Hi, Hester. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Have you written your stories down?
No, but I'm feeling a push to do so, especially the Sushila Dharma stories.
Yeah, the one you told about teaching the kids there in the school and then putting on the performance. That was so evocative, and it tugged at my heart so much.
Yeah, they were wonderful kids to work with.
Yeah. But I'd encourage you to do some writing about that.
Thank you. Lucy?
I guess Lucy's going to.
Thank you.
That was the story that really got to me, I have to say. the idea of just seeing these children and how stories affect them, I think's very powerful.
I still do it with children, and it's as well as adults, and it just never ceases to amaze me. It's because it's the basic pattern that we have, each of us has within us, I think.
Is that everybody has a story to tell. And what you were saying about all the different cultures and their stories, I came across that and I just found it absolutely fascinating. And the same with the atlas and the world. And it was like I used to say to my mum, you know, I'm sure the world was one. It just baffled me that geology just didn't seem to recognize it. And then later on, of course, it did. But it was like, well, of course it's that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's amusing.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to ask Hester something?
Now, I would just say, Hester, it would be Erfin here. It'd be wonderful to see this, written down so that the stories that you're telling us today, and also how you come to story, and your journey to it through Perseus and all that.
Yeah.
So that we could, so that people have the opportunity to learn more about what you have learned, so that can get to a wider audience.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, the way you talk about it tells a lot. A good performer, children must love it.
Yes. Thank you.
The children, I mean, your pupils, students.
Mm.
It's very complicated.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a gift.
Mm.